So first thing before we plug anything in, we are going to want to use the ohm-meter functionality of our voltmeter to check for any continuity on the entire setup. So you see if I touch that, it beeps at me. So if there's any continuity on the circuit between the power and the ground, between the ESC and the flight controller, and hopefully any other component, we'll hopefully see that here with the long beep. A very short beep is actually acceptable. We're not getting any beep at all, and then if I touch both, I get a beep. So we should be good as far as not having to use the smoke stopper. I never used a smoke stopper. I highly recommend using one. Joshua Bardwell just put out a new video on a new device that's even more intelligent than your average light bulb smart stopper. But here we go as far as our initial plug-in. Let's see if we don't see any smoke. Alright, you're not going to hear any tones from the ESC because we don't have any motors going to the ESC yet. The motors are what make the actual tones. So we're seeing a little light blinking on our LED buzzer board, which indicates things should be working properly there. We still have to set that up in Betaflight. We're seeing no lights here on our Nano RX, interestingly. There's no heat. Alright, in this video I'm just going to show you how to simply update your DJI Air unit or Vista. And basically just plug in to the USB, your USB-C port, plug, whatever you want to call it, USB cord, plug that into your Vista or Air unit, plug in full power, should hear the tone on your computer. It should take it a moment and it will pop up on your screen here. Sometimes does take a few seconds. Alright, the FPV Air Unit Lite start activation. That's my Gmail account. I read all that many times. So I've just activated it. That's complete. I am not going to do the survey. This is the new firmware update. Allows for 50 megabits. I definitely want to update. This does take a while. I have to download the firmware version, and then it's going to allow me to update the firmware to the Vista. Alright, so we just finished downloading. Now we have to transmit the firmware update to the actual Vista or Air unit. And then after it's done transmitting, it still has to do the update. This can take forever. It is also very normal for your computer to make the sound that your Vista or Air unit is connecting and disconnecting from the computer. It's simply your Air unit or Vista turning itself on and off. It may not be overheating and turning itself off, so don't stop it unless you see the actual percentage not going up for a long time. As you can hear mine, it continues to connect and disconnect throughout the 60s and 70s percentages. Every unit that I've updated, it does seem to stay at 95% for a very long time and continue to do the disconnect and reconnect sounds that Windows makes, as if you're unplugging and replugging a USB device. And that's the end of the update. You basically press back, your unit will say that it is at the current firmware version. Current, right here. You can downgrade to older versions if you so choose. Alright, I'm going to show you how to bind your receiver to your transmitter. Now I have the full-size TVS Crossfire module, so I'm just going to be doing everything right back here on the back with this screen and the joystick. So basically, I turn my radio on, get it to power up, hold down the button, go into XF transmitter, scroll down to bind and click. Now my transmitter is blinking that it's in bind mode. I simply plug in my flight controller and boom, you can see that already. The receiver and transmitter see each other. It says bind update micro RX. Click yes, and it will start the update. Sometimes you have to try this a couple times to get it to work. It stays stuck at 0. Hit cancel. Hey guys, just going to show you how to bind your DJI goggles to your DJI Vista or Air unit. So basically you just power up your Vista or Air unit, And you can power up your goggles. And wait for the green transmission light to come on, and there's this little tiny button that you can barely see on the side. It's on the side that the LED light is on, and also the USB port. You press that little button down, the light will go from green to red. And then on your goggles, once they are powered on, there's a little red button that you press and hold down until it starts beeping. Or you press down twice, and then it will start beeping. And once it sees your vista or area, it will turn the light green and beep at you. And then you'll have your image. Alright, and this is where I am going to conformal coat all the components that I can, pretty much components that I just soldered. The TBS Nano, the Josh Bardwell F7, the ESC, and the LED. I don't do anything with these little Vista systems. I've dunked them in water multiple times. I've definitely lost the camera, but the Vista unit and the air units seem to do fine if you just dry them out very, very well. I use this MG Chemicals silicone modified conformal coating. It doesn't flake off as badly as the other non-silicone version that they have. The other bottle looks exactly the same, but it's not silicone modified. It does flake off with vibration, so basically after your first quadcopter flight, you will be losing most of that protection, whereas this stuff tends to stay on a little bit longer, and you will lose it eventually, but wow. When it dries, it tends to stick the cap on very well. And I use this stuff pretty heavily. Make sure that you do not get it on any components that you do not want to not have an electrical connection any longer. So if you have a wide open antenna, you want to make sure you get it nowhere near the antenna connection. If you don't have an antenna on, you want to make sure that you really don't get it anywhere near the antenna connection. But just make sure that you dab around. Don't use the bind button, so I tend to cover them up. Same thing with the buttons on the flight controller. I don't use them usually for anything, so I just usually tend to cover them up. Get all these components really well. And then onto the flight controller. So you definitely don't want to get any of this stuff near the USB port either, because that will stop you from being able to connect to Betaflight through your USB. Some people care about that, some people don't. I don't necessarily care about it because I use pass-through, so I don't have to connect through Betaflight, but I really dump this stuff on. Some flight controller boards do have onboard barometers. If they have an onboard barometer, you want to be very careful not to get to conformal coating in the actual barometer sensor. It's very easy to do, and basically it will stop your barometer from reading completely once that fluid dries. A lot of people don't use the barometer on the actual boards. A lot of people just use GPS and get good enough altitude. But some people like to use that onboard for higher accuracy if you're using it for iNav or something along those lines. still have to solder the motor wires onto this ESC. So I'll be coming back through and melting some of this conformal coat back off. And I'm not going to hit actual pads that I tinned before. Try to stay away from those. And I try to stay away from the little rubber grommets, but there's not really too much you can do. This is one of the cheapest ways to protect your electrical components. If you land in grass or just on a misty morning, you definitely have some real problems with moisture. If you do run into moisture, make sure that you dry things out thoroughly before you plug back in. The biggest mistake I see people making is thinking that they can fly again right after they picked up their device out of the snow or out of the river. And it may not have popped anything while you were in the river, but if you go and try to plug back in, those little droplets of water will cause voltage spikes and can fry your components after the fact, after you dunk them in the water. Just gonna try to lay that so it's not laying on the table. Trying not to conformal coat the table. I like to keep my conformal coat away from my camera lens as well. I definitely dripped it on there by accident. And it is very difficult to get off the lens once it's on there. I'm going to do side as well and just hit the LEDs with some conformal. Oops. Of course I'm pulling out the other brush. Again, conformal all over the table. Alright, now we'll do the other side of the Bardwell board. These are all the voltage regulators on this back side, along with the SD card reader. And then these right here are the pads. In case this plug breaks, you can direct solder right to those pads, allowing you to bypass this plug completely and hardwire to the flight controller, which is very nice because sometimes these plugs do break off. Just in a hard crash, I've had them break off, or even plugging them in sometimes they can break off if you're not very careful, or if you just have a defective board that doesn't have the plug held down very well. See them break off. All right. So that's the conformal coating process. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Be careful with your components because you can definitely damage things as far as getting this stuff in your components. I'll come back and reconformal coat these areas right here on the ESC after I solder the motor wires to the board. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is just a little bit of motor prep. I like to cover my motor wires with some sheathing wire protector, just because if the prop hits this stuff, it seems to just bounce right off and not really do any major damage to the wires. I only have to do this with 3 of my motor wires because the other motor wire is going to be protected by the GPS arm mount. just throw these wires right inside the loom. Sometimes it's a pain in the neck to get in there, but once you get it, it looks pretty good. It makes your builds look much cleaner if you have this around your wires going out on your arms. I think anyway, it's more aesthetically pleasing. You just take some little piece of heat shrink, use this in a couple of them. Slide this over the wires and the sheathing. Sometimes a big pain in the neck to get all those little hairs in there. A lot of people say this is not worth the time. I say it is. It's a much better build quality when you have some wire protection. Let that cool down for a second. So we're going to slide another one on and go over here. So while that's cooling, we'll move on to the next motor.
Are you happy now? Are you happy now?
And motors are ready to be put on. So at this point we're going to throw our arm protectors on. These are printed by a local guy here, Haschenberg FPV. It's my go-to 3D printer here in the Denver area. These arm bumpers really do a good job of saving your arm ends. Not the prettiest things in the world, but they work. And that's what we're going for here, is functionality. Kind of just jam them on there. And the screws help position them in place and kind of keep them from falling off in a crash. And then they also have this nice bumper functionality where this part gives a little bit on these ends. Alright, so we're going to mount our GPS on the right rear arm, it looks like. So for right now, we're going to leave the motors off until we get everything arranged as far as the board layout goes. Next, we need to add our gummies to the JB flight controller. These gummies can be a pain in the neck, but are very, very necessary. These gummies that come with the Josh Bardwell F7 board seem to be some of the highest quality gummies I've ever felt. They just seem to be really rubbery and really soft, and hopefully will give some good soft mounting abilities. And hopefully I won't tear them with these scissors. I shouldn't be using something so sharp. Let's go for all these Torx bits. Eyes in the sky, gazing far into the night. I raise my hand to the fire, but it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through. All right, there's one. These gummies are a little bit more difficult to get through because they are so gummy, but I think that's going to be a very beneficial feature of this flight controller. Along with it does have the dual fusioning gyros, which is kind of nice. It fuses the information from each gyro and makes one signal. So you have two gyros monitoring your flight rather than the old style boards, which is just one gyro monitoring flight. And then if you have a problem with one or the other gyro, you can always turn one on or off, or use both. So it does also have a redundancy factor, because sometimes in a hard crash, the gyro will stop operating properly. Alright, the gummies are in. I think how we're going to mount this flight controller is the flight controller down. Then we are going to use a mount like this to mount our ESC stack. And we are going to have our receiver in the front, our camera in the front. Leave our wires for this will run underneath. general setup of how we'll send the quadcopter. LEDs are going to go up front. And now we just have to position everything correctly. I'm going to remove this antenna so it doesn't get damaged or broken in the assembly. So I am going to want to mount this first. The 30 by 30 to 20 by 20 ESC adapter. I'm going to opt to use plastic screw ends or nuts. Going to screw these down. Could be a little bit mushed because the ESC does not need any dampening other than in a crash. You don't want to damage the board as far as just a hard impact that could split boards. That's all mounted. I'm going to actually bring over the quadcopter itself. So this is going to take longer screws. I'm going to have the flight controller. I'm going to have a little bit of that. Okay, so this 1, 2, 3, 4. So the GPS is going to mount out here. This is going to mount out here. This way I have access to my USB port for programming, and I can also see my light and my bind button. I will also have access to my antenna and soldering these wires for the power and transmission. I'll also have access to my USB on my flight controller